Fresh espresso was still dripping from the counter when Derek's fingers clamped around her windpipe. Leaving a bruise was his twisted way of proving ownership. "You think you can just walk away?" He spat, his breath heavy, with the stench of stale gin and old regrets. Completely oblivious to the black SUV sliding to a halt outside the attacker, missed the sudden suffocating silence that swallowed the cafe. Consumed by his assault on a pregnant woman, Derek had no idea he had just laid hands on the wife of the city's most ruthless ghost. The bathroom floor in the penthouse was imported Italian marble. It cost more than the first 3 apartments Nora had lived in combined. Right now, it was just freezing against her bare thighs. She sat with her back pressed against the edge of the soaking tub, staring at a small piece of cheap white plastic. The contrast was laughable. Millions of dollars of real estate, and her entire world was pivoting on a drugstore item that cost $9.99. $2 pink lines. She blinked, waiting for the second one to fade. It didn't. It stared back at her, bold and unapologetic, anchoring her to a reality she wasn't prepared for. Her hands were shaking. She pressed a palm flat against her stomach. It was flat. Nothing had changed on the outside, but inside a microscopic fuse had been lit. A baby, her breath hitched, catching somewhere between a sob and a laugh. The sound echoed off the high vaulted ceiling. She had spent the last 4 years scraping her life back together, gluing the shattered pieces of her dignity into a shape that somewhat resembled a human being. And then she met Vincent. Vincent didn't ask for her glued together pieces. He just built a fortress around them. The heavy mahogany door to the bedroom clicked open. Booted footsteps padded across the plush carpet, stopping just outside the bathroom door. He didn't knock. He never knocked, but he never barged in either. He just let her know he was there. Nora, his voice was a low, resonant hum. It was the kind of voice that commanded boardrooms, struck terror into the hearts of men twice his size, and somehow managed to soothe her worst panic attacks. Vincent Casello didn't yell. He didn't have to. The world simply bent to whatever volume he chose to speak at. She scrambled to her feet, knocking a bottle of expensive bath oil off the counter. It shattered, filling the air with the overpowering scent of bergamot and cedar. "Damn it," she muttered, kicking the glass aside and shoving the plastic stick deep into the pocket of her silk robe. Vincent pushed the door open. He was fully dressed in a tailored charcoal suit minus the jacket. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the faint, jagged edge of a scar that ran from his collarbone down to his chest. His eyes, a pale, startling gray, swept the room, taking in the broken glass, the spilled oil, and finally her face. He didn't look at the mess. He looked at her hands. They were trembling. "You're bleeding," he said. She looked down. A tiny sliver of glass had grazed her heel. A single drop of blood welled up bright against the white tile. Before she could reach for a towel, Vincent was already moving. He crossed the bathroom in 3 long strides, a man who carried his own gravity. He knelt, taking her ankle in a hand that was calloused from years of things they didn't talk about at the dinner table. His touch was impossibly gentle. "I'm fine," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. She wanted to tell him, "I'm pregnant, you're going to be a father." But the words felt too heavy, too fragile. Vincent pulled a clean white hand towel from the rack and pressed it to the small cut. He stayed on his knees a moment longer, his thumb brushing the arch of her foot. "You didn't sleep last night," he noted, his voice flat, analytical, "and you're pale, just a headache." She lied. The first lie she had told him in 2 years. It tasted like ash. He stood up, towering over her. Vincent wasn't just tall. He was broad, built like a brick wall wrapped in expensive wool. He studied her face. He knew her too well. He read the micro-expressions, the slight tension in her jaw, the way she was guarding her left pocket. "I have a meeting at the docks," he said quietly, deciding not to push. He reached out his knuckles, grazing her cheek. The skin on his hand was rough. "Take the day, Nora. Rest. I'll have Leo wait downstairs if you need to go out." Leo, his shadow, his trigger man. "I don't need a babysitter, Vincent. I might just grab a coffee later." His gray eyes hardened just a fraction, a millimeter of frost. "You are my wife. You do not walk this city unprotected. Not ever." It wasn't a threat, it was a fact. She was married to the head of the Costello syndicate. Half the city paid him for protection. The other half prayed they never crossed his path. "Fine," she conceded. "Leo can drive me." Vincent leaned down and pressed his lips to her forehead. It was a lingering kiss, grounding and warm. "I'll be home by 6, he murmured. He turned and walked out, his footsteps fading down the long hallway. She pulled the test out of her pocket. The second line was still there. She was carrying the heir to a criminal empire, and all she wanted was a decaf latte from a place that didn't know her last name. The air outside was thick with mid-M morning humidity. The city smelled of hot asphalt, exhaust fumes, and the sweet, yeasty scent of bakeries firing up for the lunch rush. Nora sat in the back of the black Lincoln Navigator. Up front, Leo drove in silence. He was a mountain of a man with a shaved head and a neck tattoo that read Omia. He didn't speak unless spoken to, which she appreciated today. Her mind was a chaotic loop of ultrasound appointments, nursery colors, and the terrifying reality of Vincent's enemies, finding out she was carrying a vulnerability. "Pull over here, Leo," she said, tapping the glass partition. Leo glanced at the rear-view mirror, his brow furrowing. "Here, Mrs. Casello, this isn't our usual sector. I know, I want to walk for a minute." "Pull over." He obeyed, easing the massive SUV into a spot near the corner of 4th and Elm. It was a grittier neighborhood. Faded brick buildings, fire escapes clinging to the walls like iron ribs, and narrow sidewalks cracked by the roots of old oak trees. It was the neighborhood she lived in when she was barely scraping by when she was with Derek. She didn't know why she came here. Maybe it was a subconscious need to ground herself, to remind herself of where she started before this new terrifying reality of motherhood took over. "I'll be right behind you," Leo rumbled, putting the car in park. "Give me half a block, Leo, please. I just need to breathe without feeling an exhaust pipe down my neck." He hesitated, his loyalty to Vincent wearing with her direct order. Finally, he gave a curt nod. "Half a block, keep your phone in your hand." She stepped out onto the pavement. The noise of the street enveloped her. It was messy, human, and real. She walked down the block, pulling her cashmere coat tighter around herself despite the warmth. She ducked into the Rusty Spoon, a cramped, dimly lit cafe that smelled permanently of burnt beans and lemon polish. The bell above the door chimed a sharp, cheerful sound that felt out of place. She stepped up to the counter. The barista, a kid with bored eyes and a septum piercing, barely looked up. "What can I get you?" "Decaf Americano, please, black." As she waited, she turned to look out the front window, checking to see if Leo was in his spot. He was there, a dark monolith, leaning against a street lamp across the avenue, his eyes scanning the crowd. She felt a pang of guilt. She was being difficult. "Nora." The voice hit her like a physical blow to the stomach. It was a voice she had spent years trying to scrub from her brain. A voice that used to whisper sweet things before it started screaming of them. She froze, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. She didn't want to turn around. If she didn't look, maybe it was a ghost. "I thought that was you. You always stood like that, shoulders hunched, trying to make yourself small." She turned slowly. Derek stood near the condiment station. He looked terrible. The confident, sharp-dressed man who had charmed her 5 years ago was gone. His hair was greasy, falling into eyes that were bloodshot and erratic. He wore a wrinkled button-down shirt that hung too loose on his frame. The smell reached her before he took a step. Cheap alcohol, unwashed clothes, and a desperate, sour kind of sweat. "Derek," she said, her voice dead flat. She didn't feel the old terror. She didn't feel the urge to cry or apologize for existing the way he had trained her to. She just felt a profound, overwhelming sense of disgust and pity. He took a step closer, his eyes raking up and down her body. He took in the cashmere coat, the designer boots, the subtle gleam of the diamond studs in her ears. His jaw tightened. "Look at you," he sneered, the resentment bubbling up instantly. He always hated when she had something he didn't. Playing dress up. "Who's funding this little charade? You finally find some rich idiot to leech off of Decaf Americano." The barista called out, sliding a paper cup onto the counter. She reached for it, ignoring Derek. She took the cup, her hand steady. "I'm leaving, don't speak to me again." She turned toward the door. She didn't want a scene. Not with the secret she was carrying. Not with Leo 50 yards away, armed and trained to neutralize threats. If Derek pushed this, he had no idea the kind of hell that was about to rain down on him. But Derek had never known when to quit. It was his tragic floor. He thrived on the sick power of pulling people back down into his mud. He stepped into a path blocking the exit. The cafe was mostly empty, just an old man reading a newspaper in the corner and the bored barista. "I'm talking to you," Derek snapped, his voice rising, the thin veneer of civility cracking. "You think you're better than me now? You think you can just look right through me? You were nothing when I found you, Nora. Nothing." "Move, Derek," she kept her voice low. "Calm, you are making a mistake." He laughed. A harsh, grating sound. "A mistake? What, you're going to call the cops? We both know you don't have the spine for that. You always were a coward." He stepped closer. The proximity made her skin crawl. Her hand instinctively went to her stomach, a fleeting protective gesture. It was a micro movement, barely a twitch, but Derek's erratic eyes caught it. He looked down at her hand. He looked at her waist. He looked at the massive emerald-cut diamond ring on her left hand that he had been too enraged to notice until now. The realization hit his face in stages. Confusion, disbelief, and then a violent, ugly jealousy. "You're married." He breathed the words dripping with venom. Clears throat and what? "You're knocked up. Derek, back away right now." Her heart started to hammer against her ribs. She wasn't scared for herself anymore. She was scared for the life inside her. "Who is it?" he demanded, his face flushing dark red. He closed the distance, backing her into one of the small, wobbly cafe tables. "Some suit, some pathetic middle management loser who doesn't know your used goods." "Don't do this," she warned. She glanced out the window. The glare on the glass made it hard to see, but she knew Leo was out there. If she screamed, Lee would come through the glass. But bullets flying in a small cafe wasn't an option. You don't get to walk away from me and get a happy ending, Derek shouted, his voice cracking with unhinged rage. The old man in the corner finally looked up, his eyes widening. The barista reached for the phone behind the counter. I made you, Derek spat, spit flying from his lips. You owe me, he lunged. It happened with the sudden, chaotic violence of a car crash. Derek didn't just grab her arm. He went for the throat. It was his signature move, the ultimate assertion of control. His hand, clammy and trembling with rage, clamped around her windpipe. The force of it drove her backward. Her spine hit the edge of the wooden table, a sharp jolt of pain shooting up her back. The decaf Americano flew from her hand, the lid popping off. Dark liquid splashed across the linoleum floor, soaking the cuffs of Derek's frayed jeans. You think you can just replace me? He roared, his fingers digging into the soft tissue of her neck. Her air supply was instantly cut off. Panic, cold and primal, spiked through her veins. She clawed at his wrist, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his skin, trying to pry his fingers loose. He was stronger than he looked, fueled by alcohol and a bruised, pathetic ego. Black spots danced at the edges of her vision. She kicked out her boot, connecting with his shin, but he just leaned his weight into her, pinning her harder against the table. You're nothing. He hissed, his face inches from hers, his breath a toxic cloud. You're a playing house. Her lungs screamed for oxygen, but beneath the suffocating terror, a different instinct roared to life. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was a mother, and she was a Costello. She stopped clawing at his hand. Instead, she drove her knee upward with every ounce of leverage she had left. It wasn't a perfect hit, but it caught the inside of his thigh. Derek grunted, his grip loosening just a fraction. She gasped, sucking in a ragged, burning breath of air. At that exact second, the bell above the cafe door didn't chime. It violently snapped off its hinge as the heavy glass door was kicked open. The sound was like a gunshot. Derek jumped his head, whipping around, but his hand stayed on her throat. The temperature in the room plummeted. It wasn't Leo who walked in. Leo was right behind him, his hand already deep inside his coat, his face a mask of lethal intent. But leading the charge was Vincent. He must have tracked her phone. He must have finished his meeting early. It didn't matter how he got there. What mattered was the look on his face. She had seen Vincent negotiate multi-million-dollar weapons deals. She had seen him walk through a room full of federal agents without his heart rate elevating. She had seen him cold, calculating, and ruthless. But she had never seen him like this. There was no anger on his face. Anger implies a loss of control. Vincent was perfectly terrifyingly still. His posture was relaxed, his hands loose at his sides, but the energy radiating off him was catastrophic. He was a predator looking at a wounded rabbit that had dared to touch his mate. Derek, oblivious to the hierarchy of the city's underworld, sneered at the men in the doorway. Cafes closed suits. Back off. Derek's voice shook a bravado he didn't possess, trying to cover his sudden fear. He tightened his grip on her neck, trying to use her as a shield. Vincent didn't say a word. He didn't look at Derek, he looked at her. He saw her pale face, the hand clamped around her throat, the spilled coffee, the way she was instinctively covering her stomach, his gray eyes locked onto hers. Are you hurt? The look asked. She managed a microscopic shake of her head. Vincent finally shifted his gaze to Derek. It was like watching a spotlight pan across a graveyard. Take your hand off my wife. The words weren't shouted. They were spoken at a normal conversational volume, but they carried a weight that made the floorboards hum. The accent of his old neighborhood, usually suppressed beneath layers of polish and wealth, bled through the syllables. Derek froze. His brain, clouded by years of cheap booze and resentment, struggled to process the information. He looked at Vincent's tailored suit, the heavy gold watch, the undeniable aura of absolute power. Then he looked at Leo, who had drawn a suppressed Glock 19 and was pointing it directly at the bridge of Derek's nose. The color drained out of Derek's face, leaving him looking like a dirty sheet. You're your wife, Derek stammered, his fingers twitching against her skin. Leo, Vincent said quietly, never taking his eyes off Derek. Boss, Leo replied, stepping to the side to get a clearer angle. If he twitches, put a hollow point through his left knee. If he speaks, put one through his right. Derek let go of her, as if her skin had suddenly caught fire. He stumbled backward, his hands shooting up in the air, knocking over a chair in the process. He hit the counter, shrinking into himself, his eyes darting frantically between the gun and Vincent's unblinking stare. Nora gasped, coughing violently as oxygen rushed back into her bruised trachea. She leaned heavily against the table, her legs turning to jelly. Before she could fall, Vincent was there. He moved faster than a man his size had any right to. His arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her solid against his chest. His other hand gently, reverently touched the reining marks on her neck. His thumb traced the bruised skin, his jaw ticking once. Nora, he murmured, his voice softening entirely. Breathe with me, just breathe. She buried her face in his shirt, smelling the familiar expensive cologne and the faint scent of ozone. She clung to his lapels, her body shaking with the adrenaline crash. I'm okay. She rasped, her throat burning. I'm okay. Vincent held her for a long moment, cementing the fact that she was safe. Then slowly he turned his head to look over his shoulder at the pathetic trembling mess cowering against the coffee counter. Derek was staring at Vincent, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He finally recognized the face. Anyone who watched the city news or ran in the underbelly recognized Vincent Costello. I didn't know. Derek whimpered, urine visibly soaking the front of his jeans. I swear to God I didn't know she was yours. Mr. Costello, we used to date, I lost my temper. Vincent slowly unbuttoned his suit jacket, handing it back to Leo without looking. He rolled up the sleeves of his white shirt, exposing the thick, scarred forearms. You didn't know? Vincent repeated, his voice smooth, almost conversational. He took a slow step toward Derek. You didn't know she was mine? No, I swear. Derek sobbed, pressing himself flat against the espresso machine. Vincent stopped just inches from him. The silence in the cafe was absolute, broken only by Derek's ragged, terrified breathing. Here is your problem, Vincent said, leaning in so close that only Derek and Nora could hear him. Clear's throat. You think the fact that she belongs to me is the reason you're about to suffer? Vincent's hand shot out. It wasn't a punch. It was a calculated, devastating strike. He grabbed Derek by the throat the exact same way Derek had grabbed Nora, but with the mechanical force of a hydraulic press. He lifted Derek, a grown man, entirely off his feet. Derek gagged his hands, clawing uselessly at Vincent's thick wrist. His face turned purple almost instantly. Vincent looked up at the choking man, his gray eyes completely devoid of mercy. You're not going to suffer because she's my wife, Vincent whispered, the cold steel of his nature, fully unmasked. You're going to suffer because you put your hands on the mother of my child. Her breath hitched. He knew Vincent didn't break Derek's neck. He could have. It would have required a simple violent twist of his wrists, but doing it in a public cafe in front of a terrified old man, a paralyzed barista, and his pregnant wife was sloppy. Vincent Costello didn't do sloppy. He opened his hand. Derek dropped to the linoleum like a sack of wet cement. He hit the floor hard instantly, curling into a fetal position, gasping for air in loud, ragged wheezes. He clutched his bruised throat, tears streaming down his face, choking on his own saliva. Vincent stood over him, straightening his cuffs. The lethal energy hadn't dissipated. It had just been put back on a leash. Leo, Vincent said. The word was flat, transactional. Yeah, boss. Leo stepped forward, his massive frame blocking the morning light streaming through the shattered door. He grabbed Derek by the back of his collar, hauling the whimpering man up as easily as a stray dog. I don't care. Derek choked out his eyes, rolling back in terror. Please, I won't ever look at her again. You won't, Vincent agreed quietly. He turned his back on Derek. He walked over to Nora, ignoring the mess of spilled coffee and broken glass. He stripped off his coat entirely and draped it over her shoulders. It was heavy, retaining his body heat, and smelled of gun oil and cedar. Let's go home, Nora. Oh, he wrapped his arms securely around her waist and guided her out of the cafe. They stepped over the broken door frame and out into the suffocating humidity of the street. Nobody on the sidewalk had stopped to look. In this part of the city, when a black SUV was parked on the curb and men in suits kicked indoors, civilians suddenly found a deep interest in their shoelaces. Nora didn't look back to see what Leo was doing with Derek. She didn't want to know. The cynical part of her, the part that had grown cold and hardened over the last 4 years, hoped Derek felt every ounce of the fear he had instilled in her for years. The human part of her just wanted to forget he existed. Vincent helped her into the back of the Navigator. The leather was cool. The tinted windows instantly muted the chaos of the outside world, plunging them into a quiet, insulated bubble. Vincent slid in next to her and pulled the door shut. He didn't start the engine. He just sat there, turning his body to face her. He reached out his long fingers, gently brushing her hair away from her neck. The skin there was already turning a muddled purple and red. His jaw locked, a muscle ticked near his temple. I should have killed him, he whispered. It wasn't a boast. It was a genuine, bitter regret. Vincent, you can't just execute people in coffee shops, she rasped. Her voice sounded like gravel grinding together. Swallowing felt like swallowing razor blades. He corrected her smoothly. And I will if they touch what is mine. He put his hands on you, on my family. The word hung in the air. Family. She pulled his coat tighter around herself. The adrenaline was finally wearing off, leaving her hollowed out and shivering despite the heat. How did you know? Vincent leaned back against the seat. He looked exhausted, the kind of deep structural exhaustion that came from carrying an empire on your back. The broken bath oil, he said, his eyes scanning her face. You're meticulous, Nora. You don't drop things. You don't break things. You were distracted. Your left hand never left the pocket of your robe. When I touched your cheek, your pulse was racing. And yesterday I saw a pharmacy receipt sticking out of your purse in the foyer. She let out a shaky breath. You went through my purse. I saw the paper, he said calmly. I didn't need to read it. You haven't touched the wine at dinner for 3 weeks. You switched your morning espresso to a flat white, and today you ordered decaf. I'm not a fool, Nora. I observe the things I care about. I was going to tell you tonight, she whispered, the guilt finally cracking her composure. A single tear escaped hot and heavy, rolling down her cheek. I needed to wrap my own head around it first. I took the test this morning. 2 lines. Vincent didn't say anything. He moved closer, wrapping his arms around her and pulling her into his chest. She buried her face in his shirt, letting the tears come. She cried for the terror in the cafe, for the ghost of the girl Derek used to beat down, and for the sheer, overwhelming reality of bringing a child into this dark, violent world. He held her, his hand stroking the back of her head, a slow, rhythmic motion that anchored her. You don't need to apologize. His deep voice rumbled against her ear. You don't need to carry this alone, not anymore. The driver's side door opened and Leo slid in. He didn't look back. He just started the engine, his hands steady on the wheel. There was a faint smear of blood on his right knuckle. She squeezed her eyes shut and held onto Vincent tighter. The penthouse felt different when they returned. It wasn't just an apartment anymore. It was a fortress. By the time she had showered, scrubbing the smell of the cafe and Derek's sweat off her skin, Vincent had already transformed their living space into a secure perimeter. The heavy steel deadbolts on the private elevator were engaged. The security feeds in the control room down the hall were being monitored by 2 of his most trusted men. Nora walked into the master bedroom, wearing soft cotton sweatpants and one of Vincent's oversized t-shirts. Dr. Eris was sitting on the edge of the Shaw's lounge, packing away his medical kit. He was an older man, a brilliant physician who had lost his license a decade ago for refusing to testify against the Casello family. Now, he made house calls to people who couldn't walk into emergency rooms with bullet holes or, in her case, choke marks. The bruising looks worse than the actual tissue damage, Dr. Eris said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. He addressed Vincent, who was standing by the window, a tumbler of amber liquid in his hand. I sit for the swelling, keep her on soft foods for a day or 2. The trachea is intact. And the baby? Vincent asked. He hadn't taken a sip of the drink. Without a proper ultrasound, I can only do blood work to confirm HCG levels. Eris replied, snapping his black bag shut. But the physical trauma was isolated to the upper body. The abdomen wasn't struck. Stress is the primary concern right now. Keep her calm. I'll bring the portable ultrasound equipment tomorrow morning. Thank you, Eris. Leo will see you out. Dr. Harris gave a brief nod, offered her a reassuring smile, and left the room, pulling the heavy door shut behind him. The silence that followed was heavy. It wasn't uncomfortable, just laden with the gravity of their new reality. Vincent set his glass down on the bedside table. He walked over to her, stopping just inches away. He reached out and gently laid his palm flat against her lower stomach. It was the first time he had touched her there since the revelation. His hand was large, warm, and calloused, covering the entirety of her lower abdomen. She looked up at him. The hardened Mafia boss was gone. The man standing in front of her looked almost reverent. A baby, he murmured the words, testing the air. I'm scared, Vincent, she admitted. The truth slipping out before she could filter it. I'm terrified, his eyes snapped up to hers. Of me? No, she said, instantly covering his hand with her own. Never of you, but of this. She gestured vaguely to the reinforced windows, the locked doors the men stationed downstairs. I love you. I knew what I was marrying. I accepted the risks for myself. But a child Derek found me today. What if it had been the Russos? What if it had been someone looking to hurt you by hurting us? Vincent's jaw tightened. The mention of the rival syndicate darkened his features. Nobody will touch you, he said, the vow absolute. The Russos know the lines. If they cross them, I will burn their enterprises to the ground, brick by bloody brick. I will salt the earth where they stand. Do you understand me? I know you would, she whispered. But I don't want our child growing up in a war zone. I don't want them learning to check under cars for explosives before they learn to ride a bike. Vincent dropped his forehead against hers. He breathed in her scent, the soap, the clean cot. You think I want that? He asked softly. You think I want my son or daughter inheriting blood? I've spent the last 3 years restructuring the syndicate, moving the money into legitimate shipping real estate tech. I've been pulling us out of the mud, Nora. For you. He pulled back just enough to look her in the eye. And now for them. By the time this baby is born, the Costello name will mean boardrooms, not back alleys. I swear it on my life. She wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him. But the underworld didn't just let you walk away. It held on, dragging you back down like a rip current. You couldn't wash off generations of blood with a few legitimate LLCs. Derek, she said quietly, changing the subject. The question had been gnawing at the back of her mind. What did Leo do? Vincent's expression closed off. The vault door slammed shut. You don't need to concern yourself with a dead man. A chill ran down her spine. Not because Derek was gone, a sick, twisted part of her felt a profound sense of relief, but because of how easily Vincent could erase a human life. It was a reminder of the monster that lived beneath the tailored suits and the gentle touches. Okay, she said, leaning into his chest. Okay, She closed her eyes, listening to the steady, powerful rhythm of his heartbeat. It was a comforting sound, but beneath it, she could hear the faint, echoing drum of war drums. 3 days passed. The bruising on her neck faded from violent purple to a sickly yellow, easily covered by a silk scarf or a high collar. True to his word, Vincent kept her insulated. She didn't leave the penthouse. Her meals were brought up by a trusted chef. Dr. Aries returned the cold gel and the rhythmic whoosh-whoosh of a tiny heartbeat, cementing the reality of the life growing inside her. Vincent had recorded the heartbeat on his phone. He didn't tell her he did it, but she saw him listening to it in his study late at night, staring out over the city skyline with a glass of scotch untouched on his desk. But a secret in their world was like blood in a shark tank. It was only a matter of time before the water turned red. It happened on a Thursday. Vincent had to host a dinner for his capos, the lieutenants who managed the daily operations of the syndicate. Usually she made a brief appearance, smiling politely, pouring a round of drinks, and then retreating upstairs. It was a display of domestic stability, a subtle reminder that Vincent was a man with a dynasty. Tonight the dining room was thick with cigar smoke and the smell of roasted lamb. 6 men sat around the long mahogany table. At the far end, directly opposite, Vincent sat Dominic. Dominic was ambitious, sharp, and entirely too confident. He ran the ports on the east side, a highly lucrative operation that gave him a dangerous amount of leverage. He was a man who smiled with his teeth but never his eyes. Nora stood by the sideboard wearing a high-necked black dress, quietly directing the wait staff. "The unions are pushing back on the new shipping schedules, boss," Dominic was saying, slicing into his meat with aggressive precision. "We need to make an example of the strike leaders. Break a few knees, remind them who signs the checks." "No," Vincent replied evenly, not looking up from his plate. "We negotiate. Violence brings the feds. We are transitioning to legal cargo on those routes." Dominic scoffed a short, ugly sound. He dropped his knife onto the china plate. It clattered loudly. The rest of the table went dead silent. "Transitioning," Dominic repeated, leaning back in his chair. He looked around the table seeking validation from the older men, but none of them met his eye. They weren't suicidal. "With all due respect, Vincent, you've been talking about transitions a lot lately. Pulling back, going soft. We're bleeding territory to the Russos because you won't authorize a strike on their warehouses." Vincent slowly wiped his mouth with a linen napkin. He placed it on the table. The silence in the room became suffocating. "Are you questioning my leadership, Dominic?" Vincent's voice was a low purr. It was the exact tone he had used with Derek in the cafe. "I'm questioning your focus," Dominic countered, his eyes flicking over to her by the sideboard. It was a fatal mistake. "Word on the street is there was a mess at a coffee shop a few days ago. Some junkie put hands on your wife. A junkie who somehow slipped past our supposedly impenetrable security net." Her stomach plummeted. She kept her face blank, her hands tightly clasped in front of her, but she felt the blood drain from her cheeks. The scarf around her neck suddenly felt like a noose. Dominic leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You handled it, sure, but the fact that it happened at all. People talk. They say you're distracted, and distraction is a liability." His gaze lingered on her a second too long, especially if there's a reason you're keeping her locked up in this tower lately. A vulnerability, perhaps, he knew. He didn't have the details, but he had the scent. Someone in Dr. Orris's office, someone at the pharmacy, a loose word from a bodyguard. In this life, paranoia wasn't a disorder. It was a survival requirement. Before Dominic could take another breath, Vincent moved. He didn't yell. He didn't stand up. He simply reached across the table, grabbed Dominic by the back of his expensive silk tie, and slammed his face directly into the heavy mahogany wood. The sound of cartilage snapping echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Several wine glasses tipped over, spilling dark red liquid across the pristine white tablecloth. None of the other capos moved a muscle. They sat frozen, their eyes locked on their plates. Dominic let out a muffled scream, blood pouring from his shattered nose, instantly soaking the linen. Vincent kept his face pinned to the table, his grip on the tie acting as a garrote. "Let me clarify my focus for you, Dominic," Vincent whispered, leaning over the table, his face inches from the bleeding man's ear. "My wife is not a distraction. She is the foundation of this family. If you look at her again, if you speak of her again, if you even think about her when you close your eyes at tonight, I will personally strip the skin from your bones." Vincent released the tie and stood up. He adjusted his jacket, looking down at Dominic, who was groaning, clutching his ruined face. "You will authorize the union negotiations tomorrow. You will surrender 20% of the east side ports to Leo for your insolence tonight. If you don't like it, you can take it up with me in the alley." Vincent turned his gaze to the rest of the table. The cold, dead gray of his eyes dared any of them to speak. "Dinner is over. Get him out of my house." The capos scrambled to their feet. 2 of them hauling a bleeding, humiliated Dominic toward the service elevator. Within 90 seconds, the dining room was empty, leaving only the smell of copper, roasted meat, and spilled wine. Vincent stood at the head of the table, his chest rising and falling in slow, controlled breaths. Nora stepped forward, her low heels clicking against the hardwood floor. She didn't look at the blood on the table. She walked up to him and placed her hand on his chest. His heart was hammering. He looked down at her, the brutal violence in his eyes slowly receding, replaced by a desperate, crushing need to protect. "They know," she whispered, the reality settling over them like a heavy shroud. Vincent wrapped his hands over hers, his grip tight. He looked at the blood on the table, then out the floor to ceiling windows towards the glittering lights of the city, a city full of enemies who had just found out where the king hid his heart. "Let them know," Vincent said, his voice cold and resolute. "Let them all come. I'll bury every last one of them before they get within a mile of you." War wasn't coming, it was already here. Fear has a specific texture. It isn't the sharp, biting cold of a sudden scare. It is thick. It coats the back of your throat like dust, making every swallow a conscious effort. For 48 hours after the dinner, the dust settled over the penthouse. Vincent didn't go to the office. He converted the sprawling library into a war room. The heavy oak doors remained shut, but the low, urgent hum of voices bled through the cracks. Men came and went, men she recognized and men she didn't. They wore dark clothes, carried heavy duffel bags, and avoided eye contact with her. The elegant, curated aesthetic of their home was rapidly replaced by the stark, pragmatic architecture of a siege. Nora sat on the velvet sofa in the living room, a book open on her lap. She hadn't turned a page in an hour. Her phone vibrated on the glass coffee table. She jumped, her heart kicking against her ribs. It was an encrypted device Vincent had handed her that morning. Only 3 people had the number. She picked it up. A text from Vincent, who was 50 FT away in the library. "Come here." She set the book down and walked across the Persian rug. The guard stationed at the hallway nodded respectfully, stepping aside. She pushed the heavy oak doors open. The air in the library was stale, smelling of bitter espresso and ozone from the running servers. 4 Kupos stood around the massive desk. Leo was by the window, a rifle casually resting against his thigh, peering through the blinds. Vincent stood at the center of it all. The suit was gone. He wore dark jeans and a black Henley, a holstered sidearm strapped to his chest. He looked like the ghost the streets called him. He looked up as she entered. With a subtle flick of his chin, the room cleared. The capos filed out in silence. Leo lingered for a second, catching Vincent's eye before stepping out and pulling the door shut behind him. Vincent didn't say a word. He just pointed to the center of his mahogany desk. Sitting perfectly square on the leather blotting pad was a small square box wrapped in plain brown paper. The security seal had been broken by one of the explosives experts downstairs. The lid was off. She walked closer, her stomach tightening. "What is it?" "It arrived at the ground floor reception 10 minutes ago," Vincent said. His voice was entirely devoid of inflection. That was when he was at his most dangerous. Qua paid in cash. No cameras caught his face. She looked inside the box. Resting on a bed of cheap black tissue paper was a silver baby rattle. It was antique, heavily tarnished. Tied around the handle was a thin, dark red ribbon. It wasn't a death threat. It was a promise. "We know." "Carmine Russo," Vincent said, leaning his knuckles against the desk. "He's an old-school bastard. He thinks this is a psychological game. He thinks he can rattle the cage and watch me panic." She reached out and touched the red ribbon. The fabric was rough. "Is it working?" Vincent's gaze snapped to hers. The gray in his eyes was molten. "Panic? No, but it forced my hand. We can't hold a defensive perimeter in a high-rise indefinitely. There are too many blind spots, too many variables. If they want a war, they get a war. But I'm not fighting it with you in the crossfire." He walked around the desk, stopping right in front of her. He reached down, taking both of her hands in his. His palms were warm, steadying the slight tremor in her fingers. "You're moving," he said softly. "Tonight under the cover of a storm front coming in. Leo and a foreman element will take you to the compound in the Berkshires. It's off the books. State-of-the-art grid. You stay there until I pull the Russos out by their roots." "And you?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Where will you be?" "In the mud," he replied bluntly. "Where I belong. I have to tear down their infrastructure. Nora, I have to make the cost of touching my family so unimaginably high that no one will ever look at you again." She wanted to beg him to come with her. She wanted to tell him they had enough money to disappear, to change their names and live in a quiet house by a quiet ocean. But that was a fantasy. Men like Vincent Costello didn't get to disappear. They either maintained their throne or they were buried under it. "Okay," she whispered, squeezing his hands. "Okay. But you come back to us, Vincent. You promised me a transition. You promised me boardrooms." He brought her hands to his lips, kissing her knuckles. "I'll build the boardroom on their ashes. Pack a bag, just the essentials. You leave in an hour." The drive north was a miserable blur of heavy rain and relentless anxiety. The black armored SUV sliced through the slick, dark highways. Leo drove, his massive shoulders rigid, his eyes constantly scanning the mirrors. 3 other vehicles moved in perfect synchronization with them, a tactical convoy shielding the asset. Her. The asset was her. She sat in the back, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, staring at the raindrops, crawling diagonally across the reinforced glass. Her hand rested on her stomach. The tiny flutter she had felt earlier that week, a sensation like a butterfly trapped under a glass, was still as if the baby knew they were holding their breath. They reached the safe house just after 2 in the morning. It didn't look like a bunker. It looked like an architectural marvel of concrete and glass nestled deep in a dense pine forest. But as the iron gates rolled back and they drove into the subterranean garage, the reality of the structure became obvious. Thick steel doors, biometric clears, throat scanners, a localized generator humming in the walls. For the first 24 hours, the silence was agonizing. She paced the length of the massive living room. The floor-to-ceiling windows, supposedly bulletproof, looked out into a wall of dark, wet trees. Leo sat in the corner, a radio earpiece coiled around his neck, cleaning a disassembled Sig Sauer with methodical precision. "You need to eat, Mrs. Costello," Leo grumbled, not looking up from the slide of his weapon. "Dr. Era said you need to keep your blood sugar level." "I'm not hungry, Leo. I didn't ask if you were hungry. I said you need to eat." She stopped pacing and managed a weak smile. Lee was practically a machine, but beneath the tattoos and the scowl, he had a fierce protective loyalty that she clung to. She went to the kitchen and forced down a piece of dry toast and a glass of water. As she set the glass in the sink, the power cut out. It wasn't a flicker. It was an instant, absolute plunge into pitch blackness. The ambient hum of the house died, her breath caught. She froze in the dark kitchen. A second later, the emergency backup lights kicked on, bathing the house in a low, eerie red glow. She heard the sharp metallic snap of a magazine sliding into a grip. Leo was out of his chair and moving toward the hallway before she could even process the sound. "Get away from the windows," Leo ordered, his voice dropping an octave, losing any trace of deference. He was in his element now. "Move to the interior corridor now." She scrambled toward the center of the house, her socks slipping on the hardwood floor. Leo tapped his earpiece. "Perimeter report. Static." "Perimeter report." He barked, his eyes scanning the shadows. Nothing. The 4 men stationed in the woods outside were gone. How she whispered, her back pressed flat against the cold concrete wall of the central hallway. "This place is off the grid." Dominic. Leo spat, his face twisting into a mask of pure violent rage. His nose was broken, but he still has a mouth. He sold the coordinates. The front of the house exploded. The concussive wave hit her like a physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs. The shatterproof glass of the living room windows didn't break into shards. It spiderwebbed and blew inward in massive heavy sheets under the force of a breaching charge. Rain and wind howled into the house, bringing the smell of sulfur and wet earth. "Stay down," Leo roared. Shadows poured through the broken window frame. 3 men in tactical gear carrying suppressed submachine guns. They didn't shout. They moved with the terrifying silent precision of professionals. Leo didn't wait for them to acquire targets. He stepped out from the hallway, his weapon raised, and fired 3 times in rapid succession. The shots were deafening in the enclosed space. The first intruder dropped instantly, a red mist spraying against the concrete wall. The other 2 returned fire. The sound was a chaotic staccato mechanical tearing. Drywall exploded around Leo. Wood splintered. She covered her ears, screaming, curling into a tight ball on the floor, protecting her stomach with her knees and elbows. Leo grunted a harsh, wet sound. He stumbled back into the hallway, his left arm hanging uselessly at his side, dark blood instantly soaking his shirt, but his right hand was steady. He fired twice more, dropping the second man. The third attacker, realizing the fatal funnel of the hallway, ducked behind the kitchen island. "Ammo." Leo hissed through gritted teeth, struggling to eject his empty magazine with one hand. Blood was pooling on the floor beneath his boots. His face was entirely pale. The third man peeked around the marble island, aiming his weapon at the hallway where Leo was pinned. She was on the floor halfway between Leo and the kitchen. The dead intruder's rifle had slid across the floor during the breach. It was resting 3 FT from her hand. She didn't think. Instinct, raw and maternal, hijacked her brain. Derek had taught her how to be small, how to cower and wait for the pain to stop. But the child inside her demanded something else. It demanded she survive. She lunged forward, sliding on her knees across the polished floor, her fingers closed around the cold, heavy metal of the rifle. It was heavier than she expected, clunky, covered in the slick metallic smell of gun oil. She pulled it to her chest, rolling onto her back just as the third man stepped out from behind the kitchen island. He saw her. His eyes widened slightly beneath his tactical mask. He pivoted his weapon toward her. She didn't aim. She just pointed the heavy barrel at his center mass and squeezed the trigger. The gun bucked violently in her hands, a brutal, jarring recoil that slammed into her shoulder. The noise was blinding. She held the trigger down for 2 seconds. The burst of fire tore into the man's chest, shredding his tactical vest and driving him backward into the refrigerator. He slid down the stainless steel doors, leaving a thick, dark smear behind him, and didn't move. The sudden silence was heavier than the gunfire. Her ears were ringing a high-pitched, sustained whine that drowned out the sound of the rain. The smell of cordite was suffocating, burning her nostrils. She lay on her back, the heavy rifle resting across her chest, her hands shaking so violently she couldn't pry her fingers off the grip. She was gasping for air. A shadow loomed over her. She flinched, trying to raise the barrel again, but a heavy hand clamped down on the weapon, gently pushing it aside. It was Leo. He was clutching his bleeding shoulder, leaning heavily against the wall, looking down at her with a mixture of shock and profound respect. "You're okay, Mrs. Costello?" he rasped, coughing. "Threat is neutralized." She let go of the gun. She rolled onto her side and threw up just water and bile onto the pristine hardwood floor. "We have to move," Leo said, his voice straining. "That was an assault team. The cleanup crew will be right behind them." Before she could push herself up, the roar of an engine cut through the rain. Tires screeched on the pavement outside. Headlights blindingly bright swept across the ruined living room. Leo raised his pistol, aiming at the front door, his hand trembling from blood loss. The heavy front door was kicked open. A figure stepped into the red emergency light, broad shoulders soaking wet, a weapon in each hand. "Leo," the voice commanded. It was Vincent. Leo lowered his gun, letting his head fall back against the wall. "Boss." Vincent surveyed the room in a fraction of a second. He saw the dead men, he saw Leo bleeding, and then he saw her on her knees in the hallway shaking a discarded rifle at her side. He dropped his weapons. They clattered onto the floor. He crossed the room in 2 strides, falling to his knees in the glass and blood. He pulled her into his chest, burying his face in her neck. He was soaking wet, his clothes freezing cold, but she held on to him like he was a lifeline in a hurrack. "I've got you," he chanted into her hair, his voice breaking. The immovable object had finally cracked. "I've got you, Nora. It's over. It's done." It was done. Vincent didn't just win the war that night. He eradicated the playing field. While the assault team had been sent to the safe house, Vincent had orchestrated a simultaneous decapitating strike on the Russo organization. Carmine Russo and his top lieutenants were gone. Dominic, who had tried to flee the city after selling them out, was found in the trunk of a car at the docks he used to control. The blood that was spilled that night washed the city's underworld clean, leaving a terrifying vacuum that only one man was equipped to fill. But Vincent didn't fill it with fear. He filled it with lawyers, accountants, and legitimate contracts. 7 months later, the morning sun filtered through the sheer white curtains of the nursery. It was a soft, warm light that smelled of baby powder and expensive cotton. There were no reinforced windows here, no guards standing in the hallway outside. They had moved to a sprawling estate in Connecticut. The penthouse and everything it represented was sold. Nora stood by the crib holding a warm, heavy bundle against her chest. Their son, Matteo, was asleep. He had Vincent's dark hair and thankfully her nose. He was perfect, a tiny, breathing miracle that had survived violence, fear, and the legacy of a criminal empire. Footsteps padded softly across the plush carpet. Vincent wrapped his arms around her waist from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. He was wearing a soft gray sweater, a pair of reading glasses tucked into the collar. He looked entirely different from the ghost who had walked into that cafe. The hard, lethal edges were still there. They would always be there. But they were sheathed, buried beneath a profound, overwhelming peace. He looked down at Matteo, his thumb gently stroking the baby's plump cheek. "Leo called," Vincent murmured quietly, careful not to wake the baby. "The final transition papers for the shipping ports were signed this morning. The unions are happy. The board is seated. It's done, Nora. Every dollar we make from today on is clean." She leaned back into his solid chest, letting out a long, slow breath. The knot of anxiety that had lived at the base of her spine for over a year finally unspooled. "You kept your promise," she whispered. "I always keep my promises to you," he replied, turning his head to press a kiss to her temple. The Costello name means Clear's throat something else now. She looked down at the sleeping boy in her arms. He would never know the smell of cordite. He would never know the paralyzing fear of a man like Derek. He would never know his father as a warlord. He would only know him as a protector, a man who tore down his own empire to build a safe world for his family. She smiled, rocking slightly on her heels. "He needs to be fed in an hour," she said, handing the baby over to Vincent. Vincent took him with practiced reverent ease. The man who used to break bones with his bare hands now cradled a 7-pound infant like he was holding the universe. "I'll take the shift," Vincent said softly, staring down at his son with total devotion. "Go sleep, Nora." She walked toward the door, pausing at the threshold to look back at them. The morning light caught the faint, jagged scar on Vincent's neck, a reminder of the past. But it was fading. The shadows were finally gone. They had survived the fire, and from the ashes they had built a fortress of a different kind, one made of love, not fear. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of the future. She was just ready to live it. If you loved this gritty, emotional journey of Nora and Vincent fighting for their family, smash that like button. Tell us in the comments below. Would you have pulled the trigger if you were in Nora's shoes? Don't forget to share this story with your fellow dark romance fans and subscribe to the channel for more intense, grounded, and deeply human storytelling. Ring the notification bell so you never miss an upload. See you in the next.